Unfortunately, no.
I thank you to wait.
What is that?
All the popular, annoying podcasts.
So,
It's working. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for coming. I thought you guys were mushroom people, and that's why you walked in. Yeah, we always guess who's mushroom people and who's not. My name is Ryan Carroll. For those of you who haven't met me, I see a lot of new faces and a lot of people who have supported us throughout the year. And I just want to take a minute to thank everybody in supporting us through our first year of the Fort Collins Mycological Society. Not leave me hanging on the pause for applause, so thank you. And I also want to thank Horse and Dragon. These guys have been really supportive of us, giving us... So if anyone is on the fence about getting a beer, please get one. And we will not be offended if we see you getting up to get more beers while we give our talks here. To give you a little update as to where we are for the year, we've had several speakers and several guest mycologists come throughout the year. For new folks, sometimes in the summer we'll have actual mycologists come on forays with us so you can get an on-the-spot accurate ID in the field. So we do forays, we do some cultivation workshops, or we're planning to do our first. I've been bugging Teresa here. She's a club vice president, and she might do a cordyceps cultivation workshop. There's Ken Kassenbrock sneaking in there. He's our club officer. He's a mycologist in residence, so he comes out with us sometimes and gives us good information while we're in the field. He is the mycology teacher at CSU. So kind of cool benefits of the club. Tonight, obviously, we're here to talk about the reason for the season, Amanita muscaria. So that should be pretty cool. Give you an idea of some things coming up. We may have a presentation on Hazeldale mushrooms, our local mushroom producer in town. We're looking at maybe having one about polypores, and I actually met a fellow today who wants to give a presentation on running a mushroom shop in Amsterdam, which he did for several years, so he said he wants to come talk to us about that soon. So tonight, obviously, Amanita muscaria, Teresa is going to be talking about some of the mycology and science behind it. I'm going to talk more about anthropology, folklore, history, that kind of thing. I think you had some announcements you wanted to make too?
Yeah, so I just finished my last mycology final, so I'm done for the semester, and I pretty much just want to spend every second of my winter break just working on mushroom stuff. Like every breath needs to be about mycology. So if you guys want to, yeah, dude. So there's.
Thanks, Mike.
So there's lots of projects I want to work on. One I want to do is mycoremediation projects. So I figured we could kind of start with something simple. I want to take cigarette butts and grow a mushroom on it to break down those contaminants. So if anyone wants to help out with those kind of projects, definitely hit me up after the meeting. And I also am going to work on building up our website, some social media stuff, some more educational stuff. What else was I going to say? I think that's pretty much it.
Okay. I have a little bit to add. So with the funds that we've gotten this year for memberships, we've been able to establish ourselves as a nonprofit. So we are an official nonprofit with a real bank account and things like that, so we can pay for guest speakers to come, which is awesome.
Woo!
Yeah. And we have officially purchased the domain name, phocomycoclub.com, as well as phocomycoclub.org and all the other iterations therein. So we are the Foco Myco Club. And yeah, I think that's about it. Oh, yeah, club memberships. We're not doing them tonight because this is sort of our gift back to you guys, the community, for supporting us. But if anyone's interested for next year, we do year memberships. Those run $30 per family, $25 per individual. And that gets you access to all these talks that we put on, any guest speakers, any workshops we do, minus the cost of materials, and we don't make a profit on that. We just literally whatever it costs us, we charge for that. So I think it's a pretty good benefit, and if this is the kind of thing you want to come to more, consider supporting us in 2020 as a new member, and I'd love to take you guys on some forays and have some guest speakers come talk to you. And it's you guys and your memberships that make us able to do that. And just, again, thank you all for helping me and Teresa's dream here come true. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Teresa.
Yay, thanks, Brian. Okay. So, I'm a little bit nervous, so I've never really given a talk in front of so many people. So, if you see me like forgetting to breathe, just like remind me to take a breath every now and then. So, alright. So, Amanita muscaria.
Do you speak up too?
Oh yeah, sorry. I'll try to talk a little bit louder. Yeah, let me know if I need to start
We
speaking.
have a microphone if you want us to grab it.
Ooh,
Yes, please.
Yeah, that would be
Yeah,
great.
definitely.
Okay.
I'm going to need a minute for him to grab the microphone.
He's gonna have so many dad jokes today. You can count on him for dad jokes.
One more of those.
I'm planning at least 2 more. Thinking all these calculations.
I want chicken nuggets. I want vegan chicken nuggets. This vibe is
This
insane,
is
doesn't it?
It does.
This vibe. I want those.
That'd be a perfect.
Right here, yeah, they should have like a vegan chicken nugget bar in the back.
That's all.
Sauce. Do I have some tofu that's marinated? It kind of tastes like chicken.
And I have no idea what volume this is. Okay.
Yum. Yum. Did you guys go to the Pack the Corporate XR? No? That's okay. There's some Denver.
Okay.
They got
If it's
arrested.
Denver, I'm
Their
sorry.
fines were 15 grand. Yeah.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Mushrooms. I love mushrooms so much. Can you guys hear me? Yay.
Your hat is so cute.
Thank you. Etsy has all the cool mushroom stuff. Alright, you guys ready? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good? Okay. Alright. So, my name is Teresa, and I'm a mycology student at Colorado State University. I study soil and crop science, and someday I want to be a mycologist and study fungi, and I'm the vice president of the Fort Collins Mycology Society, and I'm also a psychonaut, an explorer of inner space. So I love psychedelics, and I'm also the president of the Psychedelic Club at CSU, and I'm also the founder of Herbal Visions, which is my little startup business online. I sell t-shirts like this, just promoting psychedelics, and I use psychedelics to treat PTSD, and it's helped me a lot in my life, and I really just want to normalize it and let people know it's not just some silly hippie thing. It can really help a lot of people, so just trying to spread that awareness. And so just a shout out to the Psychedelic Club at CSU. Nick's the vice president over there. I feel like half the people here are like psychedelic people too, so I love like the mushroom people always intertwine with psychedelic people. So we started with the Psychedelic Club last semester, and it's open to the public, so you guys are definitely welcome to come. We have all kinds of people who have never tried psychedelics, people who use it all the time, older generation, younger people, all kinds of people, so you're definitely all welcome to come. We're starting that back up next semester, so look out for that. Early February, I think. So we got lots of cool stuff planned, breath work. We'll have someone come talk about psilocybin mushrooms and peyote. San Pedro, sorry, I always get it mixed up. So yeah, Ryan's gonna talk about San Pedro. Ryan also does the integration for us too, so you guys can follow us on Facebook, Psychedelic Club at CSU, and also hit us up, Fort Collins Mycology Society, Instagram, Psychedelic Club, CSU, Foco Myco Club. So definitely hit us up. We'll post updates there, and
So congratulate yourselves, ourselves. you guys for having the first year of the psychedelic.
Yeah,
Six-month
dude.
rap.
1 whole year. And Mike's been with us since day one. So Mike is the homie. So. Alright. So okay, I just have to breathe for a second. Okay, so Amanita muscaria. It's also called fly agaric. So it's used an insecticide in Europe, so it's seen as a fly killer, and some people will like soak the amanita in milk or water, and apparently the flies will get weird from this experience, and they just kind of like go in this weird stunned coma-like state. So yeah, I kind of want to try it because I couldn't find a lot of scientific evidence on it. So maybe when there's more bugs and stuff out, we can just try it out and see what happens. But you see this little fly is getting weird, and so that's why it's called fly agaric. So Amanita muscaria are actually common in Colorado. You guys should definitely join us for forays. I bet we'll find a bunch of them. I found this one up the Poudre River. It grows in symbiotic relationships with trees like birch, pine, and spruce. So if you just like go up the Poudre River and look for those mushrooms after a good rain, you'll probably find some. So they're also common in Europe, North America, Northern Asia. This is a fresh one, and I think this is the same one, but it's just a dried out version. You can see like how much color it's lost. So yeah, it looks like totally different. So Amanita genus, they grow in like these weird little egg things. So you can see all the different various stages of it. So this is like super small. It's just kind of bursting out of this like membrane. It gets a little bit bigger. So this little membrane that covers it is called the universal veil. And as it grows bigger, it'll like, these are parts of that universal veil just like breaking off. So and these are just some more like common features of Amanita muscaria. So you can see like the gills don't totally attach to the stem. You see this like little bulbous stem base. It's called a vulva, and then white gills, white spores. This is called a partial veil. This is like a little thin membranous thing that kind of covers up the spores, and it breaks off as the mushroom gets bigger. So yeah, you can kind of see more of that here. And then you can see the mycelium here. Mycelium is kind of like the roots of the mushroom. It works through the soil, helping the mushroom get nutrients and water and that kind of thing. So okay, so we all know the classic like red and white button mushroom, but there's actually like lots of different varieties of Amanita muscaria. So they'll have like the same chemical compounds, they're just a little bit different. So I'm probably gonna butcher some of these names, so if you guys know how to pronounce it, like let me know. So this one's called Amanita muscaria variety Guess-O-Y. Is that Guess-O-Y? Guess-O-Y? It sounds weird, but so this one's more of like a yellow, orangish kind of cap. Distributed in northern Midwest, northeastern North America. I haven't found this one yet, but I heard it's in Colorado. So, and then this was one of my favorites. I think this one is just so pretty. It's Amanita muscaria var. Persicenia, I think it's called. This one's a little more peach-like, a little kind of pinkish. And there's even a white one, which was news to me because I didn't even know about this. Amanita muscaria variety alba. So you can kind of see it has little warts just like the other ones, but it's just totally white. But I would be kind of scared to pick this one just because it looks so similar to some of the more toxic Amanita species. So Amanita phalloides, this one's called death cap. So this one's like one of the most toxic ones, responsible for a majority of the mushroom deaths. Same genus, but it's just a different species, different chemical compounds. So it's common in Europe, North American coast. Not yet found in Colorado, but I recently heard that someone might have found it in like Denver or something. So just something to be aware of. If so, the little white warts will sometimes wash off, so that alba variety might kind of look like this without the warts. So. And then we have another one that's kind of a lookalike, Destroying Angel. This one, Destroying Angel, the name applies to several toxic white Amanita species, and I think some of these are found in Colorado. And eating just as little as half the mushroom can be fatal, so super toxic, liver, kidney damage. Symptoms won't even appear for 24 hours maybe, so something to watch out for. They kind of look like little puff balls when they're smaller too, so. And then another lookalike is the Amanita muscaria. So this one's a super pretty. I love how you can see like such the egginess of these kinds. They're just like bursting out of these little eggs, and you can kind of see if like the Amanita muscaria didn't have warts, it would kind of look like this. But this one's edible. It's found in Europe a lot, and so that's just another lookalike. And then Amanita pantherina. So this one has all the same chemical compounds as Amanita muscaria, and you can see like this is Amanita muscaria, but it's dried out, and it almost kind of looks like the pantherinas. But this was super red before it was dried out. So, but this one's thought to be more potent too, and I think someone said they found this one in Colorado too. So, but yeah, same chemical compounds as Amanita muscaria. So. Ooh, this is my favorite part. Hold on, let me drink. Okay. So, Amanita muscaria are mycorrhizae fungi. So, this means they act in symbiotic relationships with plants. So, I love this cute little picture of mushrooms and the plants. They're best friends. They help each other out. They kind of act like an extension of the plant roots. So, it'll inoculate the plant roots and then kind of be able to get into other areas where the roots wouldn't be able to. They're much thinner and they can just reach more areas. They can get access to other nutrients and water, and they also help break down nutrients that the plant usually can't break down by itself. And it will also help exchange information throughout to other plants, surrounding plants, and all that kind of thing. So. You can see this is with mycorrhizae fungi, and it just like creates so much more of a dense, thick thing to keep all the soil in, so it doesn't have any erosion. And you can see it without the fungi; it's just much less dense. So, okay, so there's a couple different kinds of mycorrhizae. Amanita muscaria, they form ectomycorrhizae. So these will produce fruiting bodies, but they don't fully penetrate the cell wall. They will I don't know if you guys can see this back here, but they'll form this sheath around each of the cells to be able to exchange nutrients and water and information, that kind of things. And that's opposed to endomycorrhizae, which don't produce fruiting bodies, and they actually reach into the plant cells to be able to do the same kind of thing. So both of them are helping the plant get access to water, nutrients, and information. They just kind of do it in different ways. So Amanita muscaria is the ectomycorrhizae. So this is just a cute picture to kind of show that interaction. These are plant roots, and then you can see the fungi, mycelium, kind of connecting with them, and they're so much more thinner, so they can just reach into everything a little bit more. So, okay, so this is a short clip about just trying to give you guys a visual of how they're connecting to the plant, sending them resources and information. And so this is just a short little video I'll show real quick.
Imagine you're walking through a forest. Everything might seem quiet, but beneath your feet is a flurry of conversation. All the plants around you are actually talking to each other. The trees and the shrubs and the flowers are passing information back and forth with serious life and death consequences. So how are they communicating? They're using a giant network of fungi, so pervasive and powerful that some scientists have started comparing it to the internet. They're calling it the Wood Wide Web. I'm Anna, and this is Gross Science. The so-called Wood Wide Web is made up of what are called mycorrhizal fungi. There are many different types of mycorrhizal fungi, but generally these little guys will grow on the roots of plants and provide them with water and nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus in exchange for sugars. While they're incredibly thin, the threads of the fungi can be up to 1,000 times the length of a tree root. This allows the fungi to connect together many different plants. And once connections are made, the fungi can act almost like the neurons in our brain, transporting signals from one plant to another. And these networks are everywhere. It's estimated that around 90% of land plants are connected to some kind of mycorrhizal network. So how can plants use these networks? Well, to begin with, they can help each other out in times of stress. For example, during the fall months, when paper birch trees lose their leaves and can't produce sugar, Douglas fir trees may shuttle the nutrients through the fungal network. And in the summer, when paper birch trees have lots of leaves, they send sugars to young Douglas fir saplings growing in their shadows. Plants can also warn each other of danger. Douglas fir trees connected by a fungal network can alert their ponderosa pine neighbors if they're attacked by budworms. In response, the ponderosa pine trees will produce insect-repelling chemicals, even though they haven't been directly exposed to the insects themselves. Mycorrhizal fungi can also enable parental care among plants. Some adult trees will help out their younger relatives by sending those seedlings more nutrients through the fungal network than they send to strangers. The adults may even make more room for them in the soil by reducing the number of their own roots. But not everyone is so generous. Much like our own internet, things can sometimes get a little nasty on the Wood Wide Web. Take black walnut trees, for example. They can spread poison through the network, hindering the growth of their neighbors. And the fungi making up the network can be just as tricky. Mycorrhizal fungi tend to pick favorites. They may share resources with one species of tree, but bleed another species dry without giving anything back in return. The fungi may also judge a plant's health. If they think it's too weak or sick, they may not allow it to receive nutrients or danger signals from the network. Now, we're only beginning to understand how complex these relationships get, but imagine the possibilities for agriculture and forestry. If we find out certain species share well across the network, maybe we can plant them near each other to yield better harvests or grow healthier forests. So next time you're walking through the woods or a park, don't forget to thank the fungal web beneath your feet. Ew. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you have a question about the Wood Wide Web, leave it in the comments.
I love that they called it the Wood Wide Web. It's really cool to think about like all the different things that are happening like right under our feet. There's basically this whole universe like right under our feet, and it's not just mycorrhizae and plants that are doing all this. There's this whole just universe like right under our feet. There's bacteria and fungi, there's nematodes, protozoa, there's worms, microarthropods, there's even like beneficial viruses that will kill off some bacteria and release nutrients into the environment. And it's just like this whole universe that's right under us, all these different organisms working together, living together, interacting with each other. And there's so much that we still don't know about this kind of stuff. So yeah, there's so much more that to learn, and who knows, like maybe we'll discover that there's some like microscopic little elves in the soil that are actually doing all of this work themselves. You never know. So one of my favorite things about this is, so I'm really into like microbiomes and like microbes interacting with all these different things. So this is called mycorrhizae helper bacteria. So these are bacteria that work with the mycorrhizae in the soil to actually help the fungus create that symbiotic relationship in the first place. So they're connecting with the mycorrhizae, helping them form this relationship, helping cell growth, and changing the fungus genes and everything. So, yeah, the more we learn about this kind of stuff, Amanita muscaria right now can't be like cultivated in farms or anything like that, but maybe if we learn more about the bacteria that are helping it form these connections, maybe someday we could be able to farm these, or at least promote their growth a little bit more and study them a little bit better. So that's mycorrhizae helper bacteria. And oh yeah, yeah, speaking of microscopic little elves, so Amanita muscaria is actually a legal psychedelic, and some people will call it a deliriant because it's actually connects to the same receptors as alcohol does, but I call it psychedelic because my experience seemed really psychedelic with it, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But so this is a legal psychedelic and be bought online. Some smoke shops will sell it, but it's really not something that you want to just like use on weekends with your friends. It's really intense and scary, and really you don't know how your body is going to react to it. There's so many people are so much different with how things interact with them, so there's not enough research on this kind of stuff. If you do want to try this kind of thing, know the risk. And but one of the reasons I was drawn to this mushroom, because it is a legal psychedelic, and I don't know, it just seems so like punk rock to me that this mushroom like will not let the government regulate it, and it's like, hey, you know how this is a mushroom that doesn't put up with any shit. It's not gonna let the government regulate it, and it's not gonna let them take away your life and freedom just for ingesting something. So that's why I think this mushroom is so badass. So yeah, let's talk about some of the psychoactive properties of Amanita muscaria. So there's two main compounds that are thought to be the psychedelic effects. There's speculation that there might be other ones too. There's so much more research that needs to be done with this kind of thing. So someday in the future we might be able to find some other chemicals that are part of the psychedelic experience. But so ibotenic acid and muscimol, I've also heard it called mucimol. So ibotenic acid is the prodrug to muscimol. So the ibotenic acid will convert to muscimol by decarbylation. Okay, I'm just gonna call it decarb from now on. But basically, drying it, heating it, ingestion will convert the ibotenic acid to muscimol. So both of these act on various parts of the GABA receptor in our brains. This is the brain's most important inhibitory transmitter. So you can see up here, like the GABA, muscarine, and ibotenic acid, they all kind of look super similar. And this one is muscarine, this was first described from Amanita muscaria. They thought this one was the main psychoactive effect at first, but now we know that it's in a really small amount and it's not really affecting us. That one's more in like clitosibes, inosibes, but it's not really in a big amounts in the Amanita muscaria. But so you can kind of see the ibotenic acid decarbing into muscimol. It's just losing that carboxyl group and releasing CO2. So the ibotenic acid kind of gets a bad rep. If you do any kind of research on this, it's going to talk about neurotoxins. It's going to talk about like brain lesions and that kind of thing. It sounds really scary, but if you look at the studies that they're talking about, it's actually a study that they injected ibotenic acid straight into a rat's brain. So if you can resist the urge to inject it straight into your brain, like, you should be okay, but there's still a lot we don't know about it, so still better to be avoided. The more you dry it, the more you heat it, it's going to break down that ibotenic acid into muscimol. So yeah, more research needs to be done, and I added this Twitter account. It's a Twitter account called Just Says in Mice, and I don't know if anyone's heard of this, but yeah. So they basically like post a bunch of scientific papers, and then they say, in mice, because a lot of these studies are being done with mice, and while they can be a good model, like, they aren't perfect. People aren't mice, so there's a lot of differences, and it's just good to remember that science is always progressing. We're always learning new things, and so take everything kind of with a grain of salt. Like, in the next 10 years, all of this could be irrelevant, and it could be a whole different new information. So and some of the things with mice, like, they only test male mice too, so it could be totally different, like female mice, like, yeah. Tell him, Mike. So yeah. So yeah, it could be totally different, like female mice, and what else was I gonna say? So yeah, I think that's it for that. So yeah, muscimol is the main psychoactive effect. So this one works on the GABA A, the GABA receptor. So other GABA drugs are like benzos, alcohol, antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs. It's a inhibitory transmitter, so that means it just kind of calms everything down. So that's why it's being used for like anti-anxiety kind of stuff. And I know some people who are using like low doses of Amanita muscaria to combat like anxiety, depression, that kind of thing. And I even heard someone uses it for I forget what it's called. I might think of it later, sorry. But okay, so muscimol, main psychoactive effects. Effects include drowsiness, loss of coordination, euphoria, dreamlike state, out-of-body experiences, and I found this really interesting study with low doses of muscimol and baclofen, and they basically found it helps to reduce the effects of Alzheimer's disease. So this is another rat study, so who knows, like, always be kind of cautious with rat studies, but it's definitely promising. If you look up Alzheimer's disease and GABA receptors, there's a lot of interesting information about that connection. So apparently Alzheimer's disease, like, there's some imbalance with GABA, so that's why it might be good for that kind of stuff. So it's kind of funny, like, ibotenic acid is known as this neurotoxin, but muscimol actually might help the brain, so who knows. Like, Amanita muscaria is a mushroom that taught me to question everything, not just from the psychedelic experience that it gave me, but also doing this research. There was just so much conflicting information. Like, one person would say one thing, another person, like, so I just, like, before I started becoming a scientist, I thought scientists just knew everything, you shouldn't question them, but this kind of stuff really makes me realize, like, I want to see everyone's methods and materials. I want to see every detail about everything, and so I think it's important. This mushroom has taught me to question everything. So oh yeah, so now I would like to tell you guys about my trip story using Amanita muscaria. Okay, so again, this is a legal psychedelic, but it's really, you really need to be careful with this kind of stuff. You really don't know how it's going to affect you. Everyone is so different. So just keep that in mind. It's really not something that's studied enough. But so with my experience, I took the smallest little dose, like, it was under half a gram. I thought I was going to be microdosing from it, but it was definitely not a microdose. So I made this tea out of it. I made it with ginger and I think some other mushroom. I think it was chaga. But I literally only took like 2 or 3 sips of this, and I turned it into Alice in Wonderland. Like, I was just like not even connected to my body anymore, and it was just really intense and really scary at first. And so I was like having all these panic attacks and freaking out. At one point I thought my throat was gonna like close up. I mean, every time I use psychedelics I always think my throat's gonna close up for some reason. Like, I don't know if that's some weird thing, but so I just had a lot of anxiety, and I can kind of see how it's the same receptors as alcohol, because I kind of felt like this, like, woozy kind of feeling, like drinking too many beers or something. But so I was like having these panic attacks at one point, and so all of a sudden I saw this, like, it kind of looks like this. I don't know if anyone watches The Simpsons, but this is from a Simpsons episode. But it kind of looked like this. It was like this glowy little figure that was just standing beside me, and there was like this pressure that would start from my head and it would go down my body and it would come back up, and I felt like I was in like some kind of Xerox machine, or like some kind of, I felt like I was being scanned or something. It was like really weird sensation. It was just like a pressure that would move down my body and come back up, and after that Xerox machine whatever thing, I felt totally calm. Like I felt super relaxed. All my anxiety was gone. I was just like very kind of sedated a little bit. And that's kind of when I started to astral project. I don't know if anyone knows what that is, but it's like I kind of left my body and I could like see myself from up above, and I could see myself in like some other place, and I was like watching myself, and I could like see and feel myself in both places at one time. And then there's this one point where it felt like I was in Alice in Wonderland, because it was like when Alice like turns into that giant, like I felt like I was a giant. I felt like I was like as big as this room at one point, and it was like a really weird sensation. And I also felt like I could kind of go back and forth between being super small and being super giant, and I was just like going back and forth between these sensations. So I tried to microdose and it didn't work. I don't even know. I only took a couple sips of this thing, so you should. So I don't know. You should realize like everyone's so different. I don't know if I'm just more sensitive to these kind of things or what, but just realize like everyone's different. Be cautious if you want to use this kind of thing. Do a lot of research. Realize that there are a lot of risks. Like you never know. You might get sick, you might throw up, you might just be super scared and uncomfortable, but honestly it was one of the most magical experiences of my life, and I felt like it was very spiritual and beautiful. Okay. So just keep that in mind if you do want to try it. It's not something to be taken lightly, and it was kind of scary and uncomfortable at one point, but so that being said, I think that's pretty much everything I had to say, and I figured we would kind of take comments and questions afterwards. So if we want to give Ryan a round of applause and welcome him, so I'm super excited.
Super great with me, so if you could just give it to where I only have to click, that'd be great. Computer stuff is happening. You had it open already, didn't you?
You're funny.
I didn't even say it.
But it wasn't.
You're the one with funny stories.
I am. I'm such a weenie. I'm gonna watch Xenon after this.
Yeah, a little uncomfortable, yeah.
Okay.
Not bad.
I want to watch Smart House.
How about you?
That was a good one too.
We're a bear.
So for anyone who's never seen an Amanita muscaria, we're going to pass this around. We do want it back. Don't pocket it. Okay, so Amanita muscaria and humankind, an ancient and storied history. So that is the title of my little project here. And as I'm sure you saw online, this is going to be from more of an anthropological perspective, maybe more historical or cultural, based more on speculation. And we'll talk about that a little bit here. But I thought this would be another good title for it. Amanita muscaria and humankind in ancient and stoned history. So, yeah, I just noticed that storied and stoned look almost the same as too good to pass up. So,
Stoned ape theory.
Stone Ape theory, maybe. First of all, Tell you a little bit about who is this guy standing in front of you. Obviously, my name is Ryan Carroll. I'm president of the Fort Collins Mycological Society, but my undergraduate studies were in anthropology, so I studied humankind. And that is anything from archaeology to cultural studies, linguistics, and biologic anthropology, so the study of the way our bodies are shaped, and maybe some of the influences that shape us evolutionarily and culturally. So my presentation is going to be a little bit more from this perspective. So bear that in mind as we go through. It's also going to be something where a lot of it is speculation. So we'll also see a few examples of that, and I'm sure some of you probably have a few infamous examples of Amanita muscaria speculation in your minds already. So, that said, this presentation is going to be a little bit more of a surface level presentation. The reason I'm doing it this way is because we're splitting tonight up between two different presentations, so they're both going to be a little shorter. But the other part of that is because rather than spoon feed you everything, my hope is that some of you are interested enough to go out and study this on your own after I'm done. Part of my mission here in the Fort Collins Mycological Society is to support and promote citizen science. So if you find something and you're scratching your head saying, that doesn't sound right, Ryan, my hope is that you go off later and read up more about it and learn about it on a deeper level. Or if just I've piqued your interest on something, I provided a resource list that I'll give out to some folks at the end if you're interested too. So my real hope coming away from this is not to present myself as an expert, but to hope you guys come out and become experts in the future. So that's my soapbox. That also said, like I said, some of this is going to be a little controversial. I'm going to say the word penis several times. Teresa's already talked about vulva. So, save your pitchforks and torches, because I'm not prepared to die on the hill for anyone else's ideas. I'm just talking to you about stuff that other people have talked about. So with that in mind, if we can agree to that socially, we will go forward. Amanita muscaria. So what makes this mushroom special to me? I'm going to start by telling you guys a story about when I was a little boy. My grandmother was actually from Germany, and so she told me a lot of German fairy tales when I was little. So we would sit in my basement. We had a little space underneath our stairs that she'd come down there with a flashlight and colored pencils and markers, and she would tell us old German fairy tales, and some I'm sure that she made up, and then she would draw with us and taught me how to draw. And the very first thing, a very vivid memory that I have, is my grandma taught me how to draw a mushroom. And of course, anyone who's been a little kid drawing a mushroom, the Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric, or the vapak, or the mucamore, or whatever you call it, is probably going to be the mushroom that you draw first. It's just so iconic that when you think mushroom, even when you're a little kid, this is what pops into your head most likely. And of course, anyone who's read fairy tale books, I have a great collection of fairy tale books that my children read and I read to them. And on almost every page, poking out of a corner somewhere, is an Amanita muscaria. If there's gnomes or elves or trolls or what have you, it's likely that Amanita muscaria is somewhere in the frame. And what's really interesting to me about that is that we have this cultural symbol that is correlated with the mystical. And at this point in time, we understand that it is something magical culturally, or maybe associated with mystical creatures. But any sort of underlying meaning behind that has been sort of divorced from its original meaning. We don't know why it's associated, but we just inherently have it. So it's sort of this cultural meme that stands on its own. So a big part of this presentation is going to be me trying to get into why that is. How did we get where we are? Okay, so this should be obvious to a lot of you, but some of our first encounters with Amanita muscaria, and no, it is not taxonomically accurate, but would be the mushroom from Mario. And as Teresa mentioned earlier, one effect that Amanita muscaria can have is that it might make you feel big and powerful. So I just thought it really interesting and worth mentioning that Mario turns into Super Mario and gets larger when he eats Amanita muscaria. Did the developers over at Nintendo intend this? I don't know, but it's still pretty cool. And of course, we have to talk about Alice in Wonderland if we're talking about Amanita muscaria. I found this here. This is one of the original illustrations from Alice in Wonderland. It's interesting to make note that the actual mushroom in Alice in Wonderland is not an Amanita muscaria. So this is something that we've come up with kind of culturally, but interesting enough, if you've read Alice in Wonderland, I certainly have, it's one of my favorite books. She eats the mushroom on one side and it makes her larger, and she eats the mushroom on the other side and it makes her small. Around the time that Lewis Carroll, my great-great-grandfather, I'm just kidding, we're not related, wrote this book, a fellow by the name of Cook wrote another book called The Seven Sisters of Sleep. And that book actually went over several different hallucinogens, depressants, dissociatives that were known in Europe at that time. That included things like hashish, opium, just straight cannabis, and of course Amanita muscaria was listed prominently on that. So that's kind of where we can see some of the original roots, at least in European pop culture, of Amanita muscaria being part of the zeitgeist. Comes from Cook's Seven Sisters of Sleep. Okay, so from there, it's important to talk about 1960s counterculture. Obviously, to the uninitiated with psilocybin cubensis, those of us who have maybe never taken a magic mushroom, when you think magic mushroom, you probably think of this. And there's good reason for that. Again, we talk about that association with Alice in Wonderland, Cook's Seven Sisters of Sleep. You see it in the 60s start to show up as a symbol of the psychedelic renaissance, or you could say the first psychedelic renaissance. Arguably, we're in the midst of the second psychedelic renaissance right now, fingers crossed. And you can see it starts out with more the caterpillar smoking the hookah associated with the Amanita, and it gets to the point where maybe after a while, the Amanita muscaria mushroom itself stands alone as a cultural symbol of psychedelia or the psychedelic movement. So again, we can see this as a really good example of the evolution of an idea from something that's really well-rooted, where we understand the origins, to, okay, it's kind of its own idea in itself. So you see Amanita, often you think the trippy mushroom, right? Okay, so here is a really, really blurry picture. I apologize that it's so low resolution. It's literally the best version of it I can find, and it looks even worse blown up. But it's a map of potential distribution of Amanita muscaria, and my understanding is the way that the people came up with this is where the specific host trees that Amanita muscaria is symbiotic with could potentially grow. You can see it's typically more northern latitude. There's a little patch here in Mexico, which we're going to talk about directly after this slide, I believe. And of course going down into India a little bit, which we'll mention. I wasn't really sure where else in the presentation to put this, but I thought it was really, really interesting. So I put it right here. This is a statuette of Amanita muscaria from Mexico, dated about 100 CE, so about 1900 years ago. And what's really interesting about that is when we think about Amanita muscaria cultural use throughout history, typically we understand it as being sort of something out of Eurasia, but there's a pretty good body of evidence that maybe it was used in North America, down into Central America a little bit, through some of these statues that pop up. There's also Guatemalan mushroom stones down there too, so a little bit of history of potentially use of psilocybin cubensis. But in particular, I found it really interesting that in the highlands of Mexico, where Amanita grow, there's Amanita statues. So a lot of the places where this pops up, you see potential history of use and folklore. Okay, so this map here is, I think, very interesting. This is from Gordon Wasson's 1967 publication, Amanita muscaria and Man. I got that out of the ESPD 50, Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. So I have a copy of it back there. My wife is holding it up. So there you go. All the books I use in this project are back there too, so you can take a gander after the presentation. But basically what this map is he took the plants or the trees that Amanita muscaria is associated with and overlaid it with a map of different cultural groups that were known to potentially use it. And what's really neat about that is Gordon Wasson's big pet theory, which we'll go over, has a lot to do with India. So he shows it potentially growing down in that area. And of course, we're going to talk about northeastern Siberia and, of course, over here in Lapland, too. So that's kind of what we need to know about that slide. Okay, so let's talk linguistics. This is probably one of the most difficult but most interesting, in my opinion, tools that we have in our toolkit as anthropologists. So when you look at linguistics, it can be a really good forensic tool that you can utilize when we're dealing with pre-literate societies. So groups that don't necessarily have written languages, maybe if it's something that is a group that doesn't necessarily have a lot of archaeological evidence, or even if it does, it can be used to support the existing archaeological evidence that you have. So essentially, if you've ever seen, say, an evolutionary tree of animals or plants or what have you, where they are interrelated, anthropologists sometimes try to do that with linguistics. So if you find a root word that is common across multiple languages, you can surmise to a certain degree that groups either had cultural interaction with each other, or maybe had the same root culture, or at the very minimum, exchanged information with each other. So Gordon Wasson makes the potential, the hypothesis, I guess you'd say, that the root word pan or pank or panka could be synonymous with the fly agaric or the Amanita muscaria. So you can see several Siberian groups using, for instance, the Samoyed using pon for fly agaric, or the Irtish using pan for fly agaric. And then you get into some different groups like the Chukchi, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, use pompo to mean mushroom in the generic sense. The Mordvinians use pungo. And in English, we use actually a word with this root, two words. Punk. If you've ever lit fireworks using a punk on the 4th of July, that comes from the same root word. And of course, sponge has pan in the middle of it. And some of the earliest sponges were actually made out of mushrooms. And so there's a lot of European languages where sponge is almost the same word as mushroom. And of course, in Slavic, of course, it's spangos. So, interesting thing to look at. Does it mean that Amanita muscaria is the root of all of this? Not necessarily. But these cultures did have enough interaction and a history of use of mushrooms that they were able to speak in sort of a little bit of a lingua franca about it, a shared language. Okay, so these are sort of the examples I've been talking about. Various punks, including Paul Stamets. Just joking, his hat is actually made out of the same mushroom that they use for tinder. You can refer to it as the amadou or tinder mushroom. I think it's Polyporus flammulata or something akin to that. It's in my notes. But the interesting thing about both of these different kinds of mushrooms is that they grow in association with the birch tree, which is super important to Nordic cultures. See, in ancient Nordic culture, the birch tree is actually Yggdrasil, the tree of life, or the Axis Mundi. And it's interesting that something that, when properly prepared, the Amanita muscaria, can provide either substance or spiritual substance, and that the tinder mushroom also provides you with warmth and heat, a source of light in Nordic, or a source of life in Nordic culture. That it starts to make a lot of sense that the birch tree would be considered the holy Yggdrasil tree in their ancient faith. especially when culturally you look at the way that they conceptualize these mushrooms. They don't think of them as separate organisms, they actually think of them as the fruit of this tree. So from the birch comes the tinder mushroom, comes the Amanita muscaria for spiritual or shamanistic journeying, and of course when prepared properly you can use it as a food source. Okay, so we can't talk about Amanita muscaria without talking about the Viking berserkers. So about 500 CE it's theorized, although I would argue not very well supported, that the Viking berserkers who would raid the riverine areas and coastal areas throughout Western Europe would take Amanita muscaria before battle to make them feel big and powerful and go into a blind rage. But as Teresa was talking about the effects of Amanita muscaria, it's actually pretty clear that it's something that makes you lethargic. You might doze off or go to sleep. You might be vomiting and having diarrhea, not exactly how you want to go into battle. So there's actually more recent, I guess, theories out there that perhaps they were turning their fur coats or their clothing inside out. So that would really be irritating to their skin, and they just want to get through battles so they can get this thing off of their body. So, again, it's something that I learned in school, it's something that they teach in school in Europe, but it's not necessarily true. It's just something that's interesting and kind of more of a cultural propaganda thing in Europe.
What, they're teaching propaganda in schools?
No kidding, Mike. Okay, and of course we can't get through an Amanita muscaria discussion without talking about sacred mushroom and the cross. This is the one that I was kind of hinting at. I'm not going to die on the hill for this one because it's not super well refuted in 2019, but let me talk to you about what Allegro got into. This was a fellow who was a biblical scholar back in the 70s. He helped translate the Dead Sea Scrolls. He did a retranslation of the Bible from the original manuscripts. And as he was going through it, he decided in his own translation that the word Jesus actually means a mushroom covered in God's semen. Or a penis, rather, covered in God's semen. So I told you there'd be more penis talk. And this is not the last one. But
say penis and you said Jesus. I love it.
But so he thought that there was some underlying secret messaging in the Bible. And he's not the only person to do this, but he thought a lot of it was metaphorical for mushroom journeying. Specifically, the way he described it is that Amanita muscaria was a key that more often than not, when he put it into certain locks, it fit. There's a lot of backlash about this in 2019's, again, not very highly regarded, but it is really infamous. Of course, part of the way that he got his theory going was he would look at old Christian frescoes or paintings on walls and see that, hey, when we look at this tree, this is the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden, the forbidden fruit. He believed it to be Amanita muscaria based on the way it's drawn. And of course, some of you who've probably listened to Terence McKenna have said that maybe it's psilocybin cubensis based on some of these drawings. And that's fine when you're a mycologist or a mushroom enthusiast. It's kind of like when you are the only tool in your kit is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. Because if you talk to art historians, the real truth of the matter is that a lot of times stylistically art would be based on previous works of art. So much like when you do the telephone game, when you're whispering something in a friend's ear, it starts out as something and they copy it from each other enough that it looks like something completely different by the time it comes out on the other end. So the truth is that this is just, again, just theory, but that this could be something that's just based on so many previous drawings that stylistically someone in that era would have seen this and thought tree. Again, it's something I encourage you to study if you're interested in it. But that's kind of where we're at with Allegro in 2019.
There's a song too.
The song?
Yeah, Jesus was a mushroom.
Yeah, of course.
Based on Allegro's words.
Yeah, for sure. I'm acting like I know what he talks about, but I don't. Straight up. But I'm gonna YouTube that later. The other thing we should get into, though, is Clark Heinrich's theory, as well as Gordon Wasson. They both theorized that this plant from the Rig Veda, if any of you have heard of Soma, was a magical or mystical brew that they have several epic poems devoted to the drinking of and the journeying that it can bring you through. And the interesting thing that they both pointed out, as any time that this is depicted, it never mentions any sort of leaves or bark or any plant-like features, but they do mention that it's red like the sun or orange like the sun. It often shows up in relation to discs, or sometimes they even refer to it as the sun. Another thing that they refer to it as is the penis of the bull. That's the last penis. But the reason why is because it is large and red and bulbous and potentially looks like a penis. They also refer to it pretty frequently as Soma, the spirit of Soma, as the bull sharpening its horns. It's theorized that if any of you have seen a bull sharpen its horns, the way that it does is it sticks its horn in the dirt. So it gets pointier. It sticks it in the dirt over and over again. If you pull an Amanita muscaria out of the ground, it's probably going to leave a hole that looks similar to if someone had stuck a bull's horn in the ground. So that's just a little surface level dive into some of the stuff he said. And Clark Heinrich takes it a little bit further, and of course Terence McKenna goes down this as well. They both shared a lot of information with each other. There's this idea that later, as the Aryans, that's the group of folks who wrote the Rig Veda, migrated southward from the mountains in India, that Soma became harder and harder to find, and that's sort of reflected in their literature. And as they did this, you can see the story of Shiva going southward, and this is a depiction of the gods and the demons fighting with each other over Soma. And sometime during this altercation, a poison was flung over on the god's side, so Shiva drank the goblet of poison, and that's what caused his neck to turn blue. So Clark Heinrich theorizes this. If anyone out there has picked a psilocybin cubensis mushroom and you squeeze the neck a little bit, the neck is going to bruise blue. And he also believed that this represents, as they were leaving the area where Amanita muscaria grew and going down into the lowlands, they were getting into an area where perhaps a new entheogen was going to replace Soma, being psilocybin cubensis, more associated with the herding groups down there and cows growing off of cow patties. Interesting that you see in Indian folklore that about that time is when cows became known as sacred beings as well. So there's a lot of correlations. I'm not going to say that it's causation, but there's an awful lot of mushroom symbolism that I think Clark Heinrich's Magic Mushroom book makes a pretty good argument for. So one worth reading. It's a pretty short book, so I recommend you pick up a copy if you're interested. Alright, so when we're looking at potential ancient use of Amanita muscaria, I think it's really important to look at modern groups that could be using it. So in anthropology, if you're looking at trying to determine the way something is used in a cultural group, sometimes you'll try to find an enclave group that is maybe a little bit more isolated and still carrying on traditions that have gone on for thousands of years. So we see a really great example of that in Pegtamel, which is northeast Siberia where the Chukchi people live. So if you look at these rock carvings there, they actually are from about 2000 BCE. So that's about 4,000 years ago. And you can see, and judging from what they say about these rock carvings as well, the petroglyphs show folks with mushrooms on their head that look pretty similar to Amanita muscaria. And it's interesting in their culture, if someone is being sort of aberrant or being a goofball or inebriated, they have a word for that that basically translates to mushroom-headed or bemushroomed. And that may be what this is depicting. And of course, in close association to that, we see depictions of reindeer, which has a very close association with Amanita muscaria. And just remembering, this will be something that comes into play a little later. I should mention that in Vedic texts as well, soma is associated with lightning or thunder, so that'll come into play here shortly. So here's a depiction of the Chukchi people. So their association with Amanita muscaria is really interesting. They have a crow god or a raven god who, in their folklore, ate some Amanita muscaria. This god was also associated with lightning and thunder. A lot of times, mushroom fruiting will occur in modern life, in real life, in areas where lightning and thunder have occurred. So there seems to be some sort of connection there. But the crow god ate Amanita muscaria in their legends and determined that his people, his children, the Chukchi, should begin eating or using the Amanita muscaria. But a really interesting detail there is that he also believed that he shouldn't tell them how to use it, and that it could be something that's either beautiful or super scary and dark. Same thing with how soma is described in the Rig Veda, is it can be something that's absolutely blissful and amazing and spiritual, or something that's very dark and tumultuous. So the Chukchi people have had to, in their cultural history, learn how to use this, and of course soma is also described as something that the gods didn't know how to use. So we can already start to see some parallels there. And I just want to take a moment to talk about how these people use it in modern times. So every fall, this will happen, and of course it's happening less and less as this tradition sort of withers out. But what they will do is they will call the reindeer to a new spot. They will take down their dwellings and move them to a new area for the year, so it's sort of a ritual of renewal. And one thing that happens as they're ingesting these Amanita is the reindeer love to eat them too. So it's interesting talking with Lawrence Millman a little bit, a mycologist who's written a few books that I have back at the table. He was telling me that as if you're in the Siberia or any area where reindeer are, you have to be careful if you've ingested Amanita muscaria, because as you go out to urinate, because it is not metabolized away by your body, they will actually knock you over so they can get to your urine, because they want to eat it too. So during this time, a lot of times the reindeer are already stoned on mushrooms. Thus the title of Lawrence Millman's book, Giant Polypores and Stoned Reindeer. But a lot of times too, culturally, rather than trying to herd these reindeer that are hopped up on Amanita muscaria, they'll leave sort of a breadcrumb trail of mushrooms from one place to the other. So they'll be walking along slowly, trotting, eating mushrooms, and that's how they entice them to come to the new area. Traditionally or culturally as well, during this festival that they have, this ceremony, they believe that their spirits become reindeer, and that the reindeer eating the Amanita become human. So that's just an interesting detail. As well, typically when they harvest this, I thought it really interesting to note, as someone who's studied a lot of entheogens across cultures or ethnobotany, they believe that it's very important never to damage the Amanita muscaria. So if you break the stem, you might break your leg, or if you put a rip in the cap, you might suffer a head injury later. So that's interesting for me. There's a group called the Terra Humera in Mexico who use a root that contains ergot. Neither here nor there, but they feel like if they damage it in the same kind of areas, that they will suffer injuries as well. And you see this in a lot of different groups that use entheogens in a traditional manner. But typically they'll either just lay it out whole cap and stem on sort of a mesh and let it dry in the sun, or they might put it around the ring of a fire and let it toast until it becomes cracker dry, and that helps to decarboxylate it. And of course, I'm sure some of you have heard about this. We can't get it through a talk of Amanita without talking about drinking pee. A lot of times in years of shortages, the shaman will actually eat it first and then cycle the Amanita muscaria, the muscimol, through their urine from person to person. Similarly, if you watch the documentary Pegtamel, it's really interesting. The reindeer will actually come up to each other when they're peeing and drink straight from the source. So it's a whole thing up there. One more detail. The Amanita muscaria retirement plan, as Larry Evans has referred to it with me as, basically if some folks are sick or elderly in this area, they will actually take some Amanita muscaria when they're feeling really, really bad, fall asleep for a few days, wake up feeling great, have a few good days, and then eat a high dose of Amanita muscaria, fall asleep again for a few days, wake up feeling great, rinse and repeat until death. So that's another interesting cultural use. And of course, throughout Siberia, it's interesting to note that there's a lot of variation, so you may have heard something different than what I'm telling you, because some groups say only men should take it, or only women should take it, or only the shaman should take it, or everyone should take it, including kids, or only the elderly. So just like if I order a tortilla here versus one in Cuba, it means a totally different thing. So just something to make note of. Okay, so another unifying thing that I'm trying to hit home with you guys as we go through this. What happened? Why is this tradition sort of dying out in that area? We can look as far back as 500 CE, so about 1,500 years ago, Russians started incurring into Siberia. So you can see that there were potentially two cultural groups that got split by the Russians migrating northwards, and that has continued up until this day with Russians coming into Siberia. Most notably, the USSR had a resettlement program in Siberia post-World War II, and they were pretty xenophobic about folks who used Amanita muscaria in a traditional setting. So they go to the shaman and take them up in a plane, and they say, "Oh, you eat this mushroom and it makes you fly. Let's take a look at that," and shove them out of the plane. So unfortunately, that's driven things underground. It's pretty genocidal, and that's something we can see throughout the world. Any sort of conquering culture comes in from one culture into another. They either have the option to die out or take some sort of pluralistic stance where they blend their original culture with the new culture coming in. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But nowadays in Siberia, the younger folks tend to drink vodka and avoid the Amanita muscaria. It's typically older folks or people who are really interested in preserving tradition who continue to take it, but it's really, at this point, sort of associated with the older people. Some have made the argument that there's also an economic incentive to switch to vodka because, of course, in the USSR, they wanted folks across the board to be drinking that stuff, a good way to control population. So, something to look at. Okay, so the last group we're going to talk about here is the Laplanders, or the Sami or Sami, depending on your pronunciation. These folks are in northwestern Europe. But these are the folks that we most commonly associate with Santa Claus myths in association with Amanita muscaria. I'm sure a few here have probably heard about that. But let's say you are in ancient Lapland and you are feeling a little ill on a winter's night. So you would send out word that you're not feeling well, maybe you've been hexed, maybe your neighbor has stolen your soul. All sorts of things could have happened. But the traditional depiction of Santa Claus comes from or at least is argued to come from, the shamanic dress that they would wear when they go out and gather Amanita muscaria, which would be a red and white outfit such as this. However, this shaman comes to your home, it's been snowing pretty heavily, he shows up on his reindeer-drawn sleigh, and because your door is snowed in, he is obliged to visit you through your chimney. So he comes in, takes a bite of something small, crispy, and circular, Nowadays we would call it a cookie. Back then it might have been Amanita muscaria. Of course, he's got a satchel on his back full of these magical mushrooms. And when he takes them, or when his reindeer take them, it allows him to fly to the Axis Mundi, up to Yggdrasil, which just so happens is located at the very northernmost reach in the world. So we have a North Pole that he flies up to. So this North Pole, if you look over here, as he's flying up to either seek advice from the gods or down to retrieve your soul, he might come across some helpful beings, i.e. elves. So they help him impart his gift of knowledge to you. And so perhaps he finds out that, yes, your neighbor has stolen your soul, goes down, does some soul retrieval, or he finds out something else is wrong with you, and gets some information from the light elves up in Alfheim. So that is kind of where perhaps his elven helpers or spiritual beings might be associated with. And of course, you're very grateful that he helped you get over this hex, so you pay him in the most valuable commodity that you might have in the middle of winter in Lapland, which is a very fatty cut of meat, so you repay him in food. So of course, this guy is probably a little portly because he eats a lot of fatty meat. And taking it one step further, there's a cultural belief in Lapland that if you eat the Amanita muscaria, you will take up the appearance of Amanita muscaria. So one side effect of eating Amanita is sweating or flushing, so you might be red and white and blotchy, or you might have rosy cheeks. And of course, he's a little chunky, as I said, so when he laughs, his belly might shake like a bowl full of jelly. So, is this all true? I don't know. Obviously it might be something that's a little hard to believe, that we might have such a cultural phenomenon in our society that we don't understand its true roots or meanings of. But if we go back to linguistics, I want to remind you all that today is Wednesday, or as the Nordic folk would have said, Odin's Day. And tomorrow is Thor's Day. So if you've never heard that, you might see that it's not so far-fetched that we might have some day-to-day practices that we don't acknowledge the historical roots of, because as Terence McKenna stated, we are a species with amnesia. So we don't necessarily know our full 200,000 plus year history. We've only been writing and keeping records for just a very little while, a blink of an eye, if you think about it. Okay, so last thing I'd like to mention too, obviously we put presents around the Christmas tree, and if anyone has found a nice flush of Amanita, they typically are around the base of a pine tree, or in their case a birch tree. So a lot of folks have said this could be symbolic of the Amanita muscaria. So I thought it would be really nice to put these two images right next to each other, so you could get that a little bit more visually. And of course, when you take the Amanita muscaria, you might see visions of twinkling lights. So, of course, we have these ornaments and these presents brought to us by these spiritual elf beings. Something to think about. And I just want to throw out here that that's another example of what I talk about when I say when an invading force or a dominant culture group comes in from one area to another. As Teresa mentioned, in the next few months I'm going to be giving a presentation with the CSU Psychedelic Club about San Pedro or Huachuma. That is a psychedelic cactus used in Peru. So to illustrate a point that I want to make here, I thought I would throw this out. Here's an example of two completely different kinds of San Pedro ceremonies. This one's more traditional, and this is the kind that the